my channel. Today we're going to talk about triggers. And for those of you who are not familiar with the term, though I think most people are, trigger is really mostly a psychology term that is used for those kinds of things that create a physical, mental, and or emotional reaction, usually a negative reaction in someone. They are generally tied to traumatic experiences the person has suffered in their childhood, though oftentimes people are not even conscious or aware of that. But it's something that a term in particular that's become very popular in the age of the internet over the last, I'd say maybe decade or so, particularly in social media, because we're consistently talking about how this word is triggering or how something someone said triggered someone else and created some sort of reaction and some sort of explosion, etc. So the reason why I wanted to do this video is because I wanted to reframe a little bit the conversation that we're having about triggers. Because what I found is that most people spend a lot of effort trying to avoid triggers or asking others to abstain from saying certain things or doing certain things because it triggers them, and therefore it creates a negative emotion for them, that being that anger, pain, etc. And the reason I want to reframe the conversation is because triggers are something that I consider to be not just important, but really essential in the spiritual journey and the self-development journey. And the reason why I say that is because, like I said at the beginning, if you base it on the definition of a trigger, it's something that creates a reaction in you, oftentimes an emotional reaction. And the reason why that is important is because it is showing you something within you that still needs to be healed, or at least that it needs to be paid attention to. So if I want to be a little bit more clear, I'll try to use an example of like maybe a woman, heterosexual couple are having some sort of argument or heated discussion, and the woman is upset and the man says to her something like, well, I hate when you comb your hair or when you put your hair up like that. And the woman has a complete meltdown, right? Has really strong emotional reaction that in the eyes of the man or maybe other people, like objective bystanders, may seem a little bit over the top or a little bit exaggerated. But what we don't know is that for that woman, that reaction is probably not exaggerated and not over the top, because it is a trigger for her. It is something that someone said that is taking her back to a traumatic experience that she had in her childhood. Like, for example, maybe she is the victim of child abuse, child physical abuse in her family, and one of the things that her parents said to her when they were abusing her, even if it wasn't physical, like say they were abusing her psychologically, one of the things that they used to say was, I hate your hair, right? So the reaction that she had in that moment when she was having that argument or that discussion with her partner is not necessarily based on the words that the partner said, but the emotion that that triggers. I mean, I hope you got that. Triggers. Anyways, the emotion that triggers, that is based on a trauma that she experienced in her childhood. So when you put that experience or that situation, that example in context, her reaction then is not over the top and it's not exaggerated. It's actually a pretty reasonable reaction. However, the boyfriend or the husband, whatever, her partner, may not at the time that they say that understand what those links are, and may not understand or be aware of her past trauma. So the reason why I think it is really important that we reframe this conversation about triggers is because, like I said, it is pointing you to something within you that still needs to be healed, or that needs to be at least paid attention to. Triggers are not a bad thing. Triggers are actually trying to help you. And that is true for any trigger, not just, I think I explained at the beginning when I was giving the definition that it could be physical, mental, or emotional. More often than not, what we encounter in our day-to-day life are emotional triggers, right? But triggers can also be physical, and it can be related to some sort of physical pain or physical reaction. But for example, you could even argue that certain illnesses or certain manifestations of disease could be a trigger, right? Because they may be your body's way of dealing with a traumatic experience in your childhood. So all of these things are linked together, and that's why I think it's so important that we have this conversation in a very different way, in a way where we understand that when we are experiencing a trigger, this is something, it is a part of us that is trying to help us. It's a part of us that is trying to say, by the way, pay attention to this, or this is where you need to look, right? And we oftentimes don't see it that way because it comes attached to discomfort, to physical, mental, emotional discomfort. And what we want to do is get away from that as quickly as we can, rather than do what can actually really heal it heal it and integrate it, which is actually go towards that emotion, go towards that feeling and say, or go towards that emotion. That was really hard to say. Go towards that emotion deeper to try and extrapolate and figure out what that original trauma is and where it came from. And that's something that you can do in a lot of different ways. You know, if you're in therapy, you can work on this with your therapist. There's a lot of different methodologies that can be used. If you do, it can be done through energy work. It can be done through all kinds of ways. There's a lot of different techniques like EFT, etc., that you can use to help you with that. In my practice, the way I like to work on it is through shadow work. And I think I've mentioned this in another video. Shadow work, for those of you who are not familiar with the term, is it's this idea of bringing the unconscious or your unconscious experience into consciousness. And what that does is it brings oftentimes trauma, not always negative stuff, but a lot of times usually when we work on these things for healing, it is related to negative experiences. But you're bringing all of that stuff that is in your unconscious, that you're not aware of, into consciousness, so that then you can work with them and heal them and move forward and harness their power for your own development. And that's the approach that I take in my practice, together with some energy work to ease that process and anchor that process, etc. But that is what my approach is. That's not to say that that's the only approach or that that's the best approach. It's the approach that I feel has worked best for me and is really what I love to do. But like I said, there's a lot of ways that you can use, a lot of different techniques and methodologies that you can use to harness really the power of your triggers to really enhance and augment your self-development and your healing and spiritual journey. So that's pretty much the end of this video. For those of you, as always in the comments, for those of you who've never heard of triggers, I'd love to get your opinions about that, about the subject in the comments, down in the comments. I also, as usual, for those of you who are familiar, I'd love to hear what some of your triggers are and how you're working through them. And I'm happy to share some of mine. I have plenty. And as always, thank you for your attention, and until next time, namaste.